I couldn't believe how much gear was in this bag when my mate Dal brought it over for me, and he said there was a camera inside with a few filters. And then I started to investigate, rummaging through the bag. It gave me a good insight as to how much gear there was available to photographers back in the day. I mean, did you need all this gear? My first film camera was a Minolta Dynax some 20 odd years ago, and I can remember buying it in the shop and just walking out with a box and a UV filter. But it looks like Dal has bought the whole shop back in the 90s just to get into photography. So there's so many filters inside this bag. So in this video, I'm going to show you guys what these filters are, what they do, and also show you the two cameras that Dal gave me as well, and the simple checks that I made to see if they work. I can only imagine back in the day visiting a photography shop with a small budget was quite exciting. You'd walk in, there'd be a guy there called Barry, or Bazza for short, and there'd be a glass counter, and there'd be so much gear that you could buy for your hobby going forward. Yeah, good morning, mate. I'd like to get into photography, please. Oh, that's wonderful, madam. I have everything under the counter for the starter photographer. I'll get all the essentials for you now. I love your hair, by the way. And I can only imagine that Barry would go underneath the counter and bring out a whole load of stuff for you and say, you know, you'll need this and you'll need one of these, you'll need one of these, you'll need one of these. This day and age, we've got it all in Photoshop. If you want to buy it or get into photography, go onto a shop, buy your mirrorless camera, spare battery, maybe a UV filter in a bag, and off you go. But back then you didn't have Lightroom, Photoshop or computers, so you had to have all these different filters that give you different effects for your film. And I couldn't believe how many filters are inside this bag. I'll quickly go through a few of them. I mean, you've got a snow filter, you've got a fog filter, a soft filter, a starburst filter, and also this strange looking credit card vignette filter. So I wanted to see what the effects of some of these filters were. So I set up a small scene with a digital monochrome camera and took some before and after photographs. I'll show you those in a short while, but let's get on with the cameras that Dal gave me, the two Praktica cameras. I'll show you the checks that I did to see if they work, and then we'll get on, I'll show you the filters and what they do. So the first camera in the bag was this Praktica TL, and this is like from the 1960s. I can't imagine Dal was out in the 1960s trying to buy film cameras, so I can only imagine this was handed down to him from a family or a friend or someone, but this is a very old camera and it works. I had to do a few checks with it, just check the light seals at the back, make sure that they're all intact, make sure they're not flaking or falling apart, and they're not. And also this has got a silk curtain, so I had to make sure that that silk curtain didn't have any burn holes in it, because if you leave an aperture open and pointing at the sun, as I did recently on a Pentacon 6, you can burn a little tiny hole in the silk curtain. It's not ideal. So just shining the light torch through the lens and having a look at the curtain, and you'll soon see if there's any holes in it. Luckily this one hasn't. This camera goes from 1 second all the way to 1/500th of a second, and it was a little bit sticky when I first got the camera out. I started to go through the shutter speeds, listening for the changes by ear, and when I got down to sort of 1 second it was sticking, but after a few turns you can see and hear that it still works perfectly. So I'm looking forward to using this camera as we go along. It's got an M42 screw fit mount, which is really handy because I've got quite a few M42 screw fit lenses, and it's even more handy because the lenses that Dal gave me, the apertures don't work. They seem to be getting stuck. I could send them off for a CLA, but to be honest with you, I looked at these lenses online and they're probably just as cheap to buy a decent used one. And the other camera that he gave me was a Praktica MTL5B. This one is from the 1980s, and again I checked everything, went through the shutter speeds by sound and also by looking through the back of the camera onto the lens, and they all seem to be working really well. This one goes from 1 second to 1/1000th of a second. So I can imagine back in the day this was a really good budget camera for anyone wanting to get into film photography, or photography I should say. If you said I want to get into film photography back then, they'd probably laugh at you. Back into photography, and it was quite, I suppose, photography on a budget. I don't think this camera was as expensive as your Nikons or your Olympuses or your Canons at the time. But as long as this camera works, as long as the shutter speeds work and there's no light leaks, there's no reason why I can't get any decent photographs using a good lens. This camera has also got a light meter inside, but that seems to be a little bit jittery. So even though I've checked the battery and that seems to be working okay, I've put a new battery in it, the light meter is a little bit touch and go. So I'm not going to rely on the light meter with this camera. I'll just use a little tiny simple light meter. So it is quite amazing to find that there are cameras in bags that haven't been used for years. I mean, Dale hasn't used these for probably a good 2 or 3 decades, I'd say, and they've been stored in a bag. And he's a good mate of mine. He come around, we had a cup of tea, and he said, Roger, I've got some cameras for you. I'm never going to use them. He said, I may as well give them to you. I said, nice one, cheers. Went through. I couldn't believe how much stuff was inside. And there's probably a whole load of hoarded stuff all around the world of film camera bags just like this with loads of goodies inside. I suppose it's just a case of either knowing someone or having a little tout around online to see if anyone's got any gear that they want to sell or give away. Now, the question is, do you need all the filters that you've got here? To be honest with you, I hardly ever use a filter. If I do, it may be a ND filter if I want to do some slow motion sort of, you know, seascapes or something like that. I never use a graduation filter, although I've got some. I never use the fog or snow filters. All I ever use is a UV filter if I want to keep the lens protective, if it's an expensive lens, or a yellow, orange or red filter if I'm doing some landscapes, just so I can get some nice separation up there in the sky between the blue sky and the clouds. So what filters were in the bag? There was this yellow filter which increases contrast slightly, gives a moderate separation between blue sky and cloud, and it also can cut through haze. It can reduce skin tone blemishes and is a pretty good much all-round filter to keep in your bag. There was this 80B blue filter, which I believe is for colour film balance. And there's also a YG or yellow-green filter, which can add a bit of contrast to scapes. It can lighten foliage, and it's supposed to be good for portraits and skin tones. There's also a polarising filter, which is ideal for eliminating glare and reflections from surfaces such as water and glass, and also it's good for darkening skies. And there's this soft filter. I've never used one of these, but I can only imagine that it softens portraits and give a more dreamy look. And no doubt Liz Taylor would have been screaming for something like this to be used back in the day. I might use it on a video camera for myself. There's also a starburst filter. These are good fun and does what it says on the tin, and I can imagine the looks are quite effective on car headlights or nighttime street lights and candles, etc. And there's also a snow filter. Now in my test, this gave a strange look on the highlights, almost bloomy highlights. So I'm not sure how I would use this one. There's a fog filter, and when I used this, the filter appeared to reduce contrast. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be for foggy days or not though. There's a sepia graduated filter. Now these are ideal for scapes and for darkening skies. This one is a sepia kind, so maybe it's specific to colour film. I've never seen one before. And we've got an ND4 filter, which darkens the scene down by about 2 stops, so that's handy if you want to shoot slower shutter speeds in the daytime. And there's this strange hole in the wall filter. I think this is for creating a vignette around your scene, something you can easily do in the darkroom or in Photoshop, but it's still fun to try. I did similar a few weeks back with Vaseline on a UV filter. And talking of UV filters, there's also your standard UV filter. It doesn't really do much for black and white photography except protect your lens. And it can be a pain sometimes, especially with cheap ones, as you can get unwanted reflections off of highlights. Now I'm not a fan of UV filters, but I do use them sometimes to protect some of my more nicer lenses down the beach. And this is quite a fun one. Now this is a fisheye adapter, which I look forward to trying out. With a wide lens you can get quite an undesirable look, but with a 50mm lens you get this kind of fisheye look to your photographs. So that will be interesting to experiment with in the future. So I took this MTL5B, I put a roll of FP4 in there, which I bulk loaded, so I only put half a roll of film on it, and I went down the farm just to test it out, just to make sure there's no leaks and that the shutter speeds are working as I want them to work. I'll show you those images now that I've come back with, and then I'll leave it there, guys. That's all the gear that I've got there. And then remember, if you're getting into film photography, it's great if you can get all this stuff. It's good to play with, but really you don't need it all. Just grab yourself a decent camera, make sure it works, and a UV filter I'd always recommend, just to protect the lens if you're, you know, if you're a bit touchy about that. And I'll leave you with the pictures that I took down the farm with a couple of different lenses. I'll show you those now, and I'll catch you next time. Have a great weekend.